Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give it a few minutes to let everyone log in. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to make sure everyone's aware that our session is being recorded today. It'll be available on our YouTube channel after it gets uploaded. I also have a couple announcements. My name is Donna King. I'm with the SWAPTA board. I'm the newly assigned webinar coordinator. I want to make sure everyone's aware that our spring box is shipping soon. It's going to be so great. So if you're not a SWAPTA member yet, you might want to consider joining. Our SWAPTA swag boxes are part of the membership. And we want to thank our sponsors, Flowbird, Tez, and Desmond for this upcoming box. Our next social event is May 6th. It's going to be a Cinco de Mayo event, so super fun. Please plan on joining us. You can register on our website. And then our next webinar is going to be May 19th about electrifying transportation. So you can register for that as on our website as well. Sorry about that. So on this webinar, this is our topic on inhabited vehicles. As a municipality, I am super excited about this. This is an issue we deal with every single day. So our speaker is Christina Jones. Just give you a little information about Christina. She is a parking and transportation analyst with Walker Consultants. She has long been driven by a desire for meaningful work, whether through her volunteer work promoting STEM skill development among young women and at-risk populations. She's involved with IPMI, PIPTA, and SWAPTA, and providing parking planning services to support right-sized solutions and strategies for municipal, higher education, and private clients throughout the country. Christina earned her bachelor's degree and master's degree from Mount Mercy College and the University of Dubuque, respectively. In her free time, Christina enjoys spending time exploring the Front Range with her dog, Kinnick. So I'm going to turn it over to Christina. She's going to do her presentation, and then she'll have questions and answers available after the presentation, but you're also welcome to post them in the chat.
Thank you, Donna. And just a quick thank you to everyone who's able to join us today. Super excited to share with you the research I've put into inhabited vehicles over the last couple of years. We talk a lot about equity in parking management and influencing the behaviors to promote the most efficient use of the public system in terms of how it serves residents, visitors, customers, employees, and the other typical users, if you will. But to really address the equitable use of the parking and the parking resources, the policies that support those resources, we really need to recognize another growing base of parked vehicles and parking system users, that of course being inhabited vehicles and the vehicle inhabitants. So the nomadic lifestyle of those who are choosing to inhabit vehicles has grown exponentially over the last decade. by some estimates as much as 300% over the last 3 years. These vehicle inhabitants by choice are adding to the existing population of those who are inhabiting vehicles due to housing challenges and economic circumstances, which in and of itself is growing as living costs continue to rise. And of course, the country continues to come out of this recession and battle the impacts of the pandemic. I'd like to start off just by saying very quickly that as I started researching inhabited vehicles back in 2018, it was really hard to stay specifically within the realm of parking management. This topic is so intertwined with social services and the larger issues that relate to homelessness that while I do touch on that somewhat today, I really had to keep bringing myself back to parking and parking policy. So with that in mind, today's goals are to identify the typical impacts that vehicle inhabitants have on the on-street parking system, explore a few examples of how current regulations and programming that have proven successful in other communities that are experiencing significant impacts due to inhabited vehicles, and share some of the steps to effectively address the challenges related to parking and inhabited vehicles, specifically within the on-street system. So through my research, I identified 3 kind of main types of vehicle inhabitants. Each displays a set of similar characteristics and behaviors related to how they park, similar to how we identify customers and residents and their parking needs. So these would be in addition to and completely separate from those storing inhabitable vehicles or RVs that are parked on street by residents between their uses. So for the purposes of today, inhabited vehicles include vehicles that are inhabited by those who are experiencing economic hardship or homelessness, vehicles inhabited by those who are traveling for leisure, and vehicles that are inhabited by your hashtag van lifers or those who are choosing more of a permanent or long-term nomadic lifestyle. One of the first trends that I identified was the correlation between the inhabited vehicle's location and the type of vehicle inhabited. From there, I defined more of the common characteristics and impacts that were associated with those inhabitants. Leisure travelers and van lifers generally park in close proximity to destination centers. For instance, national parks, ski resorts, beaches, theme parks. This group typically takes quite a bit of time to research the areas where they can park for free and without violating any parking regulations. Popular spots generally include the residential neighborhoods and Bureau of Land Management areas. This group really in particular, they've developed a really sophisticated network of resources, including mobile apps such as iOverlander and Dirt Maps, but there are a lot of Redditor boards, Facebook groups, websites, YouTubes, and much more so as of late, TikToks even, that address how to successfully inhabit a vehicle, where to park, how to evade enforcement. Leisure travelers and van lifers generally have one of the lower environmental impacts on their location. Their vehicles are generally equipped to handle waste, and they typically have the means and pre-plan where they can properly dispose of at designated sites. But that being said, this group can be incredibly difficult to impact behavioral change because of their available means and their tendency to move in much larger areas when they do move. For example, a citation might just be considered part of their vacation costs. In some communities, the cost of a citation is far less than that of a night at a hotel. And let me tell you, I saw this a lot on the message boards being discussed. There are instances of those who are visiting larger cities in close proximity to theme parks where the hotel is well over $200-300 a night, but the citation is only $50 to $100. And that, of course, is assuming they even intend to pay that citation before leaving the area. Next, we identified those who are experiencing economic hardship And notice that they generally park in one of two kind of neighborhood contexts or land use contexts. The first was in close proximity to social services, and this tends to overlap with your core business districts, or in some cases, a medical district. But both of these areas are well served by transit, as intending to serve those further out in the community at a centralized location. This group also tended to gravitate towards the light industrial areas, and more specifically, the transitional space between residential and light industrial. Out here, parking is generally unmanaged and they can go unreported for longer periods of time. That, of course, being said, they do try to avoid paid and time limited areas when possible, but when they can't, they do move their vehicle fairly frequently, but in a relatively small area. We're talking, 1 or 2 blocks at a time. But with these frequent movements, even when they're moving the vehicle, the occupancy impact that they have really doesn't change at a fairly micro level. So that one space within a 1 to 2 block radius is always occupied, which can drive up the occupancy for the overall area. As opposed to leisure travelers or van lifers who, when they move, they're generally moving entire states or even regions at a time. This group also presents perhaps the most significant environmental impact. Their vehicles are generally not designed for habitation and the accommodation of waste. They lack maintenance that is necessary and common with these vehicles to avoid dangerous leaks and breakdowns that could render them inoperable. And the improper of disposal and trash can very quickly pose environmental impacts to not just other individuals around them, but to the landscaping and the wildlife in the area as well. There are additional concerns with waste impacting not just the environment, but the utility of the curb and gutter itself. Not only can that improperly disposed of waste enter the storm sewer system, but it can build up and lead to blockages. And these blockages can prevent the drainage of the roadway, which can then cause pooling on the road surface and increase the risk of hydroplaning and your wet pavement vehicle crashes. Of course, there's the utility below the curb and gutter to be considered as well, where reasonable access really is necessary to service connections to water, gas, sewer mains. You often also have buried cable and telecom within this area as well. Within the residential neighborhoods, storage of habitable vehicles was probably the most frequent complaint or issue within these areas. These included residents who are storing their vehicles between uses, and to what was a much lesser extent, but grew, of course, over the past year, was visitors to area residences or residents who were relying on their RV to isolate from family during the pandemic. Because these are not actively inhabited, though, they do typically present probably the least environmental impact of the various users that we identified. But that's not to say that they don't come with their own set of problems. So often equivalent in the length of 2 to 3 vehicles, RVs and oversized vehicles can contribute to high occupancies that can stress the on-street parking supply and contribute to spillover into adjacent districts and zones. These can also present significant impacts in terms of interrupted sightlines for drivers and pedestrians and first responders as well. So as you can see here, because of the vehicle size, they're not only blocking the identification of the address of this home, but they're blocking pretty much the entire location. So of course, this impacts the ability of first responders to locate that address or any activity that might be occurring on that front lawn in front of that address. And then of course, these vehicles can contribute to hazardous conditions and collisions of passenger vehicles when they're parked near intersections, creating visual obstructions for other drivers, but also for pedestrians and cyclists who are in motion and vice versa. So trying to judge how quickly a cyclist is coming down the road can be incredibly difficult when you have a very large vehicle blocking your view for most of your available uh, timing to react to that. So we kind of touched on a few of the impacts on the various groups, but I just wanted to kind of take a moment to review those and get into a little more as to why it's so important that we manage the curb lane, especially as it relates to inhabited vehicles. As most of us on this call today know, parking is a very limited resource, and there's only so much of the curb lane that's available. More and more so, we're seeing that parking is not the only demand on this incredibly valuable space. In addition to parking, the curb accommodates passenger loading, your Ubers, Lyfts, taxis, as well as freight and commercial loading, and to a growing extent, e-commerce and pickups and deliveries. There's other forms of mobility that are accommodated on the curb as well. Bike lanes, dedicated transit lanes. We're seeing more bicycle storage and micromobility moving to the curb, again, to reduce those conflicts and promote and maintain an ADA accessible sidewalk. Over the past year, we've seen more activation within the right-of-way as well, with food trucks and street festivals, parklets, and then greening of the space with rain gardens and planters and outdoor seating and such. In addition to this, there's the increased occupancy and reduced turnover of the on-street spaces from long-term parking, or in some extreme cases, permanent occupation of on-street parking. This not only reduces the accessibility to area land uses for others, but it can reduce the parking supply to commercial deliveries and freights, which then we see an increase in double parking and impacts to the traffic lane and others' ability to travel. Beyond the impacts of the efficient use of public parking in the right-of-way, there's reasonable access to the utilities. As I mentioned, and as we can see in this photo here, the public right-of-way contains a really complex labyrinth of buried utilities and connections, everything from your water and sewer to electrical, gas, and communications. And in many areas, the right-of-way is regulated to improve the efficiency, not just of parking, but of maintenance operations that support travel in general. For instance, your snow removal and street sweeping. These operations not only provide the clean parking spaces and pretty streets, but they support that utility of the curb and gutter. As I mentioned, clogged gutters and drains contribute to incredibly unsafe driving conditions, reducing friction, concealing potholes and line markings, and leading to hydroplaning in some instances. In communities out here in Colorado, it's not uncommon for parking to be prohibited on street during the winter or even just during snow events. For example, in Steamboat Springs and Jackson, Wyoming, they prioritize snow removal over parking to ensure safe conditions for those who are traveling on the roadways. So the current regulations that I came across as I was researching inhabited vehicles really kind of fell into one of two buckets. The first being direct restrictions, and then the other being time limits. With direct restrictions, they're generally including prohibiting habitation of vehicles or prohibiting RVs and oversized vehicles from parking in certain areas or kind of on street in general. Some examples of variations on the direct restrictions include Adams County, Colorado, and Colorado Springs. In Colorado Springs, the code doesn't expressly prohibit inhabiting vehicles, but it does specifically say you cannot use an RV as a permanent dwelling unit. So based on how the court might interpret this code and its intent, that does not address the use of personal vehicles for habitation. For instance, a converted van or a passenger vehicle might not likely be applicable under the language as it's specifically stated today. Whereas RV owners in Colorado Springs can only park at their residence for the expeditious loading of the vehicle. Otherwise, it cannot be parked in a side yard or on the driveway or anywhere within the residential property. It has to be stored off-site. One of the issues that they're seeing with this is that RVs have to meet age requirements at many of the camps in the area. For instance, at an RV camp, they have to be no more than 10 to 15 years old. And while these are private policies that are in place at private properties, they are contributing to a larger issue of equity within the city that for many individuals and families living in their RVs otherwise would be homeless. In Adams County, the RV or oversized vehicle must be associated with a specific residence. Now, this was done to accommodate residents, visitors, while also discouraging the use of the vehicle as a primary dwelling unit or use of the public right-of-way for long-term storage of that vehicle. These vehicles are allowed to park once each calendar year for up to 30 days. So if I were to visit my family in Adams County and stay for a week in April, I did not stay up to 30 days. Coming back in October, I could not use the balance of those 30 days. It's a one-time up to 30 days chance. In the image shown here, which is from Rawlins, Wyoming, this was captured by a local reporter taken of the camper for the mayor of the town. And this was actually taken on the evening that they were voting on their ordinance for parking of RVs within the right-of-way. This issue had been brought up several times to council and was actually reviewed by the resident review committee and supported and approved and recommended to council for approval based on safety hazards due to visibility and traffic flow related to these. While council did vote down, the ordinance is now planned to be on the ballot for the next cycle because residents have been pushing this issue still, and it's such an important issue to that community. A broader strategy that's used to regulate inhabited vehicles among other parking system users, and one that's quite familiar to many of us, I'm sure, is time limits. Time limits regulate the duration or the specific hours a vehicle may occupy a space. It can apply to the space itself or to a specific category of vehicles. And in some instances, these can even vary throughout the week or even throughout the day. In the city of Carlsbad, California, for example, they regulate the hours during which RVs and oversized vehicles can park on street. Here, the oversized vehicles and trailers are prohibited from parking on street anytime from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. This was done to provide convenient access during the day to residents and visitors, of course, being within the coastal zone, while also discouraging overnight parking and using that public right-of-way for the long-term storage of personal property. Seattle, Washington uses a very common approach, the 72-hour limit, on the duration that any vehicle can stay parked in a place on the street. This is really standard throughout the country, and it's generally used more so to prevent long-term storage within the right-of-way or the abandonment of vehicles. In Seattle, what was interesting is that if a complaint of an inhabited vehicle is made, the city reportedly sends a letter to the person filing that complaint, letting them know that vehicle inhabitation is not illegal and that the city no longer installs or enforces overnight parking in any area unless there's a specific business need. The letter is reported to go on to ask that the person filing the complaint practice compassion and recognize that simply living in a vehicle, as long as no other violation occurs, does not break any laws. In Jackson, Wyoming, they also use the 72-hour limit for on-street parking during summer months. During the winter, they do prohibit parking on street completely for snow removal purposes. But during the summer, the 72-hour limit is used to discourage inhabited vehicles and storage of personal vehicles as well. As I mentioned, they prohibit parking on street during the winter completely, even though it is also their peak visitor time. And when they see many of these RVs and visitors coming to the area and putting that strain and that need for parking is at its greatest. Um, the winter parking ban is incredibly common throughout the mountain region, specifically within ski resorts. This would include Crested Butte, Steamboat Springs, and Breckenridge, Colorado as well. So how do we effectively impact change in parking of inhabited vehicles? First, my suggestion is to identify the type of vehicle inhabitants that are affecting your parking system. Where are the reports coming from? What is the commonality to the type of complaints that's being received? And then based on these type of complaints, define your desired outcomes. What are the goals of any parking regulation that you might be considered? And keep in mind that these are likely already outlined in a parking or transportation master plan. So for instance, maintaining equitable access to the curb lane, supporting business or tourism, or promoting sustainable transportation options. Then once you've identified your outcomes, work backwards from there and develop policy that meets those outcomes. So rather than starting with potentially biased solutions, you're starting with your outcomes allows you to really broaden your available toolbox of options that you can use to address these issues. Designing your policy and programming based on outcomes also helps reduce the likelihood of just treating symptoms rather than the causes. And it can help prevent creation of exclusionary policy that might come with some negative perceptions. What I feel is perhaps one of the most important steps is to identify partner organizations. These are organizations that have parallel missions, complementary and supplementary resources, and perhaps help avoid just moving the problem down the street and really getting to the root causes. So some great examples that I saw as they relate specifically to economic hardships and identifying the organizations that can provide some of those supplemental services. A common one that a lot of people generally go to first are safe lots. And these come with a set of considerations that really should be thought through prior to just taking an open gravel lot and inviting those with those who are inhabiting vehicles to use that facility. Of course, there's liability concerns. Parking lots are generally not covered under typical insurance policies for habitation. They require some sort of innkeepers or lodging insurance, which in and of itself comes with an additional set of requirements that many parking facilities don't meet. There's the safety and consideration and security considerations as well, not just of the campers and residents, but of those employees and businesses within the area as well. This is both in terms of perception and the actual design of the facility itself. And all of this, of course, costs money. There's the extra insurance, the improvements necessary to meet the insurance requirements. There's the cleanup and infrastructure that's needed for the site. And then, of course, you have the additional wear and tear on the facility on top of what its primary use was intended for. That's not to say that they can't be done and done well, though. One of the, I don't know if I want to say it's the first, but one of the oldest programs that I came across comes out of Santa Barbara. They started their program in 2004. It was a partnership between a counseling center, the city, and several local faith leaders. Today, they're now running 23 lots and providing over 130 spaces. And what's really great about this program is that it provides a centralized location or several centralized locations, out of which they can distribute over 450 pounds of food a month and also bring a lot of those social services to residents within those facilities. The Homes Partnership in Philadelphia provides police officers who are responding to complaints of inhabited vehicles a first option to extend housing resources to those vehicle inhabitants rather than moving immediately to a warning or a citation or towing the vehicle even. In addition to providing over 1,000 housing units, they also offer skill building and work experience, as well as providing healthcare and addiction recovery services. As within this area, that represented a significant portion of those who were inhabiting vehicles within the community. It's not always economic circumstances that lead to significant numbers of individuals who are inhabiting their vehicles. In Jackson, Wyoming, there is a lack of workforce housing available for seasonal employees who are drawn to the resort area every winter and summer. To help address this, at least during the summer, the town offers a municipal campground at the Teton County Recreational Center. To qualify for a space here and to park their inhabited vehicle, the applicant has to be employed within Teton County. And while the cost of the parking space includes access to a shared porta potty and a picnic area, to gain shower and bathroom access within the rec center, they do have to apply and obtain a membership for that at an additional fee. And while this does seem a little pricey for a parking spot, the campground does fill quickly each year, and the town has reported a wait list for each season that they've had it opened. So this has been very successful for that community. In researching inhabited vehicles and their policies and programming, I really felt that Portland had perhaps one of the more comprehensive approaches to the issues that I came across. They have many partnerships involved and clearly demonstrates the dedication at all levels within the community to not just addressing the symptoms and the impacts of inhabited vehicles, but really getting to the root cause. Simply addressing complaints without providing support will only push the problem to other areas within the city. This guiding principle to how the city developed a really thorough framework is exhibited in the multitude of offerings and partnerships that they have. I just have a few here, but a lot of them are based or kind of under the umbrella of the Homelessness and Urban Camping Impact Reduction Program. Under this kind of umbrella, if you will, there's the Service Coordination Team, which is a phased program that provides housing and addiction treatment to individuals with chronic arrests. This for Portland was a significant kind of representation of those who were inhabiting their vehicles within the community. One phase of that service coordination team program is called Clean Start, and this provides a mentored work experience. What's really interesting about Clean Start is that many of the participants themselves were once homeless, so they're able to provide a uniquely sympathetic and really compassionate response to reports of urban campsites and inhabited vehicles. They can not only provide information on available resources to those that they encounter, but they can also provide a testimony and kind of a very personal example of the success of these programs. Another program that they offered was the Portland Police ID Project. For many, the lack of identification is a barrier to obtaining not only employment, but for applying for rental housing or assistance from state or federal agencies. But a lack of a permanent address can be a significant barrier to obtaining an identification in and of itself. So through the Portland Police ID Project, officers aid those who need help navigating the system and the paperwork in order to obtain that identification without a permanent address. And then last but certainly not least, they have, through a partnership with the Portland Bureau of Transportation, they have the vehicle inspection and abandoned auto teams. These respond to all calls involving fifth wheel trailers, campers, RVs, and even passenger vehicles that after initial inspection are found to be occupied. Any vehicles that are found to not be occupied goes to the abandoned autos team. And similar to Clean Start, these members are specifically trained in how to work with community members without, sheltering, and who without their vehicles would otherwise be homeless. A lot of the challenges to effectively addressing inhabited vehicles really seem to stem from perception. There is the all too familiar "not in my backyard." Not only do neighbors not want their neighbors storing their oversized vehicles on their street, but they don't want their own ability to store their oversized vehicles and RVs on their street. In addition to that, they don't want inhabited vehicles on their street or services that address homelessness even within their neighborhood due to safety and property value considerations. For example, Denver was looking at providing several safe outdoor spaces for designated homeless campsites. And one of the first locations that they were looking at was the Denver Coliseum. Of course, the residents within this area were strongly opposed to the site. And while it didn't provide social services in closer proximity than any of the other options that was being presented, it was central to an area that was already experiencing a high concentration of unofficial or unorganized urban campsites and inhabited vehicles. The intent of the city was to organize those who were already within the area and provide a safer, more controlled environment for those that would benefit not just the campers, but for the residents as well. However, residents had a fear that this organization and improved facilities would draw additional campers to the area, being the first of its kind. In addition to the safety and property value perceptions, there are perceptions that social service programs generally cost more than what their measurable benefit is. I use again the example of Portland, and it may not seem obvious at first, but if you'll bear with me here, they tracked the costs and the outcomes specific to the service coordination team, which for every $1 that they invested in that program, they saw a $13 benefit to the community, specifically in the reduced costs that are associated with crimes. For Portland, they had a significant proportion of those who were living in their vehicles as having arrest records or high recidivism rates, if you will, which for Oregon, they have an approximately 42% recidivism rate overall. For those within the service coordination team, though, that drops to just 18% for graduates. For those who don't graduate the program, but they do participate in it, it still drops to just 30%. And then, of course, there's a lot of shame and stigma for those who are living in their vehicles. For these individuals, oftentimes their vehicle is their last significant possession of value. And holding on to it not only is a point of pride, but that vehicle facilitates their ability to hide their situation, not only from friends and family, but from their employers. And that ability to disguise that situation from your employer is seen or is perceived as necessary to maintain your job or to get a new job, if you will. And of course, we can't get away from talking about COVID these days. So, as I mentioned, COVID is, and it's going to continue to impact the way we all live, work, and travel. In an industry that unfortunately has itself a negative perception as being revenue driven and parking enforcement is out to get them, I really think that parking professionals have been, one of the unsung heroes of this last year. Your agility and creativity, the compassion that I've seen from parking professionals has really supported and led to some creative solutions as we've shifted our culture and increase the amount of takeout and pickup, not just, of pizza and the prepared food that we were doing prior to COVID, but more so to groceries and housewares and really all goods in general. Just this last weekend, I did curbside pickup at both Home Depot and Designer Shoe Warehouse. This is very common now, and it's really changing the way that we think about parking and how it serves the community. As early as last March, before we were even under statewide mask mandates or safer at home orders here in Colorado, Fort Collins signed an emergency order that allowed residents to use RVs for social distancing and to isolate during the outbreak. Essentially, the emergency order waived the 7-day limit on how long a vehicle could be inhabited at a private property. It did not change the prohibition on parking within the public right-of-way, but it did give emergency responders and our first responders an option to isolate safely and comfortably from those within their households. Fresno, California passed a similar order just a few weeks later in April, which permitted inhabited vehicles on or in front of a private residence property if it was inhabited by an essential worker who was using the vehicle to isolate from family or housemates, or if the inhabitant had been ordered from a physician to self-isolate. There's, of course, the lasting impacts to the travel industry itself. RVs provide a controlled environment compared to that of airlines or hotels. And what we're seeing is many families are preferring remote destinations or extended road trips this summer over some of the more common crowded theme parks and resort areas. Last July, Travel and Leisure reported record sales of new and used RVs, and RV stocks continued to soar well through October. This summer, we're already seeing RV rentals booked up, with these rental facilities now competing with those who are looking to purchase their own RVs to expand their stock to meet that increased rental demand. Unfortunately, it's not all good news. From May to June of 2020, the number of mortgages that exceeded 90 days past due more than quadrupled. And it's now at levels higher than anything that we've seen in the last 20 years. When you add to this renters whose protections from eviction via the CARES Act and state orders expiring, this is all leading to what could be a housing crisis with record foreclosures and evictions that's fueling that growing trend for inhabited vehicles. So really, communities need to be prepared to equitably and compassionately address the impacts of inhabited vehicles. Focus should really be maintained on practices that do not punish individuals simply for being poor, but really do stress efficient use of the public parking system while identifying those partnerships and available community resources that are already existing and can maximize outcomes. We'll want to assess the current impacts of the inhabited vehicles through field study and review of complaints to identify the patterns unique to that community. Like so many parking problems, inhabited vehicles' real impact to the public parking system and the perception can be magnified by a vocal few. So we want to look at, is this I shouldn't say a real issue, but is it as significant of an issue as a few might be making it out to be? And of course, with such a sensitive issue, you'll want to engage the community through outreach and education. You want to rely on service experts with a specific focus in parking who can provide targeted, compassionate, third-party communication to learn from those who are most impacted and can also be some of the most difficult to reach through traditional outreach efforts. For many in this position, especially as we're coming out of a pandemic, trust in community leaders can be negatively impacted. Having that neutral ear who doesn't have a perceived bias can initiate and guide impactful discussions and bring stakeholders to the table from all sides of the issue. Policies are often developed to promote turnover and increase availability of parking or to limit the negative impacts of trash in residential areas. But you want to look at if these are really the ultimate goals of the community. Again, go back to your parking or transportation master plan and look at, does the community's policy address these symptoms of a larger issue, or is it simply rolling them down to be someone else's problems? Are we meeting those original goals that we established for that system? And then finally, when you're developing your policy, you want to build in language that's going to allow for flexibility. That way you have the ability to respond to events like a pandemic or a wildfire or a derecho. Really whatever 2021 or 2022 decides to throw at us. So with that, I welcome your questions and I look forward to hearing how your communities are addressing inhabited vehicles.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was an amazing presentation. We do have a question in the chat from Paul. He says, how are urban areas handling these vehicles, especially when they become scofflaws? Are municipalities immobilizing or towing? And what are trade-offs between compliance and social responsibility?
Yeah, really, I've seen it addressed multiple ways. Like so much with parking management, there isn't going to be a cookie cutter solution that's appropriate for everyone. I can, point to the example of Portland. They do try to avoid towing or immobilizing whenever possible. For the reasons, as I previously stated, there's a lot of benefits to maintaining access to those vehicles, but they do try to provide alternative locations or solutions for those individuals. That's where safe lots really come into play. And I just saw an article come out yesterday that Sacramento had developed their own safe lot program as well. So that seems to be a very popular choice and one of the more compassionate responses that I had seen.
Thank you. I want to remind anyone, if you do have a question, you're welcome to raise your hand or post in the chat. I'm happy to unmute you. I do have my own question. We, in the city of Paso Robles, had a campground, for lack of a better word, set up, but we were not able to get participation in it. Part of the security and safety protocols were that people were not allowed to be intoxicated or under the influence of any drugs or have any weapons. And so we had really no interest in the homeless population of using those services. So how are our other municipalities overcoming that?
Yeah, one of the solutions that I saw was bringing those addiction and recovery services to those locations. For those who have no interest in addressing their addiction or recovery efforts on their own, that is really difficult. And that's where I would really reach out to those partner organizations who specifically look at addiction recovery and intervention services and rely on those.
And thank you. Is there anyone else with any questions before we wrap up? All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat or anyone speaking up. So Christina, thank you so much. I do want to remind everyone we have our social event and our webinar, our next webinar coming up. So make sure you visit our website at southwestparking.org and register for those events.
Thank you.
Thank you for everyone for joining us.